I made a mistake the day I handed my son-in-law a cup of coffee, and smiled like I didn't already know what he was planning to do to me. That's the part that stays with me, not the betrayal itself. I'd seen that coming for months, the way you see a storm building over flat land. What bothers me is that I smiled, genuinely smiled, and I handed him that cup with two hands, the way my mother had taught me to show respect, and he took it without looking up from his phone. That was the moment I knew I had him. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to the beginning, because the beginning matters. It always does. My name is not important. What's important is that I spent 31 years working for the county water authority, saved everything I could, bought a house in a neighborhood people said was up and coming, back in 1987, and watched it actually come up. I raised one daughter in that house. Her name is Renee. She has her mother's eyes and, unfortunately, her mother's taste in men, which is to say, she falls hard and fast and doesn't always look where she's landing. Her mother passed 9 years ago. Ovarian cancer, stage 3, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. That kind of loss changes a man. It changed me in ways I'm still discovering. One of the ways it changed me is that I became, as Renee once put it, hypervigilant. I prefer the word careful. I became careful. I paid off the house the year before my wife got sick. I liquidated some investments, took the penalty, and wrote the check. People thought I was foolish. My financial advisor at the time, a young man named Bart who wore shirts that were always slightly too tight, told me the numbers didn't support it. I told him I wasn't interested in the numbers. I was interested in the house being mine, clean and clear, before anything happened to change things. 4 years after my wife died, Renee brought home a man named Dex. Dex was 41 years old, which put him 14 years ahead of Renee and 18 years behind me. He had the kind of face that photographs well, strong jaw, easy smile, the sort of look that makes strangers trust him at gas stations and hardware stores. He worked in real estate acquisitions, which I learned meant he found undervalued properties, connected sellers to buyers, and collected a finder's fee. Not quite an agent, not quite an investor. Something in between, something without a clear job title, which should have told me everything. He was charming. I'll give him that. He remembered things. The second time he came to the house for dinner, he brought a bottle of hot sauce I'd mentioned liking once, in passing, during a conversation that had lasted maybe 4 minutes. That's not a small thing. Most people don't listen that carefully unless they want something. I noticed it. I filed it away. Renee asked me, 6 months later, what I thought of him. We were sitting on the back porch, the way we do, the way we've done since she was a teenager, and we'd talk about things that mattered. She had her coffee. I had mine. The yard was quiet. He seems capable, I said. She laughed. That's the least romantic thing you've ever said about anyone. I'm not trying to be romantic. I'm trying to be honest. She looked at me over the rim of her mug. You don't like him. I didn't say that. You didn't say you did. I watched a cardinal land on the bird bath my wife had put in the yard 20-some years ago. Still there. Still drawing birds. I think he's very good at reading people, I said finally. I think he figures out what they want to hear. I'm not sure yet if there's something real underneath that. Rennie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, He makes me happy, Dad. And that was the end of the conversation, the way it always is when someone leads with their heart. They got married 18 months later. Small ceremony, maybe 60 people, backyard of a venue in Decatur. I walked her down the aisle, which in a backyard meant I walked her about 40 feet across the lawn, but I held her arm and I meant every step of it. Dex cried at the altar. Real tears as far as I could tell. Maybe they were. I've stopped being certain about what's real with him. For the first year, things were fine. They rented an apartment not far from here. Renee kept her job at the school district. Dex kept doing whatever it was he did, which seemed to involve a lot of phone calls and lunches, and not a lot of traceable income. They seemed happy. Or she seemed happy, which amounts to the same thing for a father. Then things started to shift. It happened the way these things do. Not all at once, but gradually, like a current you don't notice until you're already off course. Dex started making comments, small ones, at first. This neighborhood must be worth something now, huh? At dinner, one Sunday. You ever think about downsizing? On a walk we took around the block. Rennie says you've got savings, which is great, but are you keeping up with inflation? I know a guy who does senior wealth management. Senior wealth management. I was 63 years old. I didn't say anything. I let the comments wash over me. I made neutral sounds and changed the subject. But I started paying attention the way I hadn't before. not to what Dex said, but to what he was looking at when he thought I wasn't watching. The bookshelves, the closet in the hallway, the lockbox I keep on the shelf in my bedroom closet, the one that's been there since Renee was a kid, that used to hold her mother's jewelry and now holds documents. He was cataloging. The realization settled over me slowly, and then all at once. He wasn't interested in me. He was interested in what I had. I want to be careful here, because some of what I'm about to tell you involves my daughter, and she didn't deserve any of it. She is a good woman. She trusted the man she married, the way you're supposed to trust the person you marry, and that trust was used against her as much as against me. Maybe more. The first concrete thing I noticed was the question about my will. We were having dinner, Renee, Dex, and me, at my kitchen table, which is where we eat when they come over because the dining room feels too formal for family. I'd made pot roast, the slow cooker kind, the recipe my wife used to make that I finally figured out after 3 years of getting it wrong. Renee had seconds. Dex had a beer and barely touched his plate, which usually means someone's working up to something. Dad, he said. He'd started calling me Dad about 6 months into the marriage, which I'd never asked him to do. I've been thinking. With everything going on in the world, estate planning is something more people should be taking seriously. Have you updated your will recently? I looked at him. Then I looked at Renee, who was studying her pot roast with great concentration. My affairs are in order, I said. That's great. I just want to make sure Renee's protected, in the event of, any eventuality. Any eventuality, I repeated. He nodded. He had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable, but only slightly. My affairs are in order, I said again. Would you like more pot roast? He did not want more pot roast. After they left that evening, I sat in my armchair for a long time. The house was quiet the way it gets after people leave. That particular quiet that's made of the absence of sound. I thought about my wife. I thought about what she would have said about Dex, and I thought I probably knew. Then I picked up the phone and called my attorney. His name is Leonard, not the young Bart type, but a man in his late 60s who went to law school in Alabama and has been practicing in Georgia for 40 years and does not waste words. I told him what was happening. He listened without interrupting. You want to put some things in place, he said when I was done. Yes, protective things. Yes. Smart, he said, and that was all he said about it. Over the next 3 weeks, Leonard and I made some changes. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would raise flags. But the house, the title to the house, was restructured. The lockbox in my closet was relocated. Certain financial accounts were adjusted. I also did something I'd been thinking about since the dinner where Dex asked about my will. I started being less sharp around him, not dramatically less sharp, not stumbling over my words, forgetting what day it is less sharp, just softer, a little slower, pausing a beat too long before answering questions, repeating myself occasionally, the way people do when they're starting to lose the thread, mentioning my doctor's appointments more than necessary, referring to things I'd misplaced, my reading glasses, my keys, with a kind of vague anxiety that I could see Dex filing away the way I'd once filed away his. I was giving him a story. I was letting him write it himself. Renee noticed first, of course. She's my daughter. About 2 weeks into it, she called me on a Tuesday morning before she had to be at school. Dad, she said, you seem, I don't know. Are you sleeping okay? Some nights are better than others, I said, which was true. Dex mentioned you seemed a little confused at dinner last week. When you forgot, you'd already told the story about the water main on Elm. I had not, in fact, forgotten. I'd told the story twice on purpose. But I said, yeah, I've been repeating myself a little. It's nothing, sweetheart. The silence on her end lasted about 3 seconds. I'm going to make you a doctor's appointment. You don't need to do that. Dad, Renee. She made me the appointment. I went. The doctor, who is not in on any of this, just to be clear, said I was in excellent health for my age, which is fine because I was not performing for the doctor. I was performing for Dex. He started coming around more after that. Alone, sometimes, stopping by to check in when Renee was at work, which had never happened before. He'd sit in my kitchen, drink my coffee, and talk about nothing in particular, and I could feel him watching me the way you watch something you're about to pick up. Assessing weight, assessing value. During these visits, I made sure to mention, casually, the way you mention things that haven't quite solidified in your memory, that I kept some important documents in the lockbox in my closet, that I sometimes had trouble remembering where I'd put the spare key, that there was a certain amount of cash I kept in the house, a habit from my father's generation, though of course I couldn't always recall exactly how much or where. I mentioned my mother's rings. I mentioned that I'd meant to move things to a safety deposit box for years but kept putting it off. None of this was true. Not a single word of it. But I said it in the right tone, the slightly distracted tone of a man who started losing track of things, and I watched Dex absorb it. He was still charming. I want to give him that. He was genuinely warm during these visits, laughing easily, asking about my past, listening to stories about my wife, with what appeared to be real attention. Part of me wishes I'd been wrong about him. Part of me kept waiting for the evidence to point somewhere else. It didn't. The call I wasn't supposed to hear happened on a Thursday afternoon in March. I'd been in the backyard, deadheading the roses my wife had planted along the fence, which is a job I take seriously because she would have. I came back inside through the side door, which doesn't make much noise, and I could hear Dex on the phone in the front room. He thought I was still outside. He hadn't heard me come in. I stood in the kitchen and I listened. He wasn't loud. He wasn't careless. But he wasn't whispering, either, because he thought he was alone. And that's the thing about people who are careful. They stop being careful when they think no one's watching. Not going to be a problem, he was saying. He's getting forgetful. Renee's noticed it, too. If we move on the house now, before, yeah, exactly. The account he mentioned, the one he keeps at home, I think it's in the closet. I can get in there when, look, he trusts me. He does. I just need a few more weeks. I set down my gardening gloves very quietly on the kitchen counter. I stood there for a moment, looking at the wall where my wife had hung a small ceramic rooster that neither of us particularly liked, but that we'd bought at a flea market in Savannah on our honeymoon and never had the heart to remove. Then I went to the living room and said, "Everything okay?" Dex startled. "Just slightly, just enough." Yeah, he said too easily. "Just work stuff? You want more coffee?" "Sure," he said. "Thanks, Dad." I went back to the kitchen and made him more coffee. I handed it to him with 2 hands, and I smiled. That was the day I called Leonard again. What I set up in the following 2 weeks required some coordination, but not a tremendous amount. The lockbox in my closet was moved to Leonard's office. In its place, I put a different box. Same size, similar weight, the kind of thing you can find at any hardware store, with a combination lock that happened to use my wife's birthday. Inside the box, nothing of financial value. A letter, 2 photographs, and something else which I'll get to. I made sure to mention to Dex, in the foggy way I'd been cultivating, that I'd finally gotten around to moving some things in my closet. That I kept the combination written on a slip of paper in my wallet because I was scared I'd forget it. I patted my back pocket when I said it. I watched his eyes go there. I also called the 2 people who needed to know what was happening. My nephew, who lives 40 minutes away and had worked financial fraud cases for 17 years before he retired, and Renee. Calling Renee was the hardest thing I've done in a long time. She didn't believe me at first, that's the honest truth. She sat across from me at this kitchen table, and she listened to everything I said, and then she was very quiet, and then she said, "Dad, I think you might be misinterpreting. Renee, he loves me." He wouldn't. "I know you believe that. Don't talk to me like I'm a child. I'm not. I'm talking to you like you're my daughter, who I love and who deserves to know what I know." She sat with it for a long time. Long enough that I got up and brought us both glasses of water and sat back down, and the kitchen was very quiet. "What do you need from me?" she said finally. Her voice was different when she said it. Smaller and older and more certain. "I need you to not tell him anything, and I need you to be here on Saturday." She nodded once. "Okay. I want to stop here and say something about my daughter. The easy version of this story makes her naive, makes her someone who couldn't see what was in front of her. But that's not fair and it's not true. Love is not stupidity. The willingness to believe the best about the person you've chosen to build a life with is not a flaw. It is, in fact, exactly what makes betrayal so devastating, because the thing being exploited is something decent. Renee did nothing wrong. I want that on the record. Saturday came cool and overcast, the kind of March morning that can't decide if winter's done yet. I'd told Dex on Friday, on the phone, that I was going to be at my doctor for most of the morning. A follow-up, the kind of appointment that happens when you've convinced people you might be declining. I mentioned, vaguely, that I might be a while. I mentioned that Renee was working a half-day at school. Neither of those things was true. My nephew arrived at 7:15. He parked 2 streets over and came in through the back. Renee arrived at 7:30. We sat in the kitchen with the lights off in the front rooms and we waited. Dex arrived at 9:47. I heard his key in the front door, a key I'd given him 2 years ago when Renee asked if he could check on the house while I was visiting my brother. A key I'd never asked for back. He was quiet coming in, quieter than he needed to be if he thought he was alone. He went through the front room, down the hall, into my bedroom, which I'd left open. The three of us stayed in the kitchen. My nephew had his phone out. Renee was looking at the table. I heard the closet door open, the soft scrape of the box being moved, the small sounds of someone trying to work a combination lock. He took a while with it, longer than I expected, but eventually I heard the click, then a long silence. Renee reached across the table and put her hand over mine. I hadn't realized my hand was clenched. The bedroom door opened, then footsteps in the hall, and Dex appeared in the kitchen doorway. He stood there. His face went through several things in the space of about 2 seconds. Shock, then calculation, then a kind of deflation I've never seen on him before. Like something load-bearing gave way. I looked at him steadily. "Find what you were looking for?" He didn't answer. "There's nothing in that box," I said. "There hasn't been for 2 weeks. But I imagine you know that now." My nephew stood up from his chair. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His presence said everything, the way the presence of a certain kind of person always does. Renee looked at her husband. She didn't look away. "Dex," she said, just his name. But the way she said it, that was the end of something. He tried for a few moments to explain. The words came out the way they always do in these situations. Fragments, justifications, something about just checking, something about worried about the finances, something about this isn't what it looks like. But the thing about a man who makes his living reading people is that he knows when a room has turned. And this room had turned. Inside the box, along with the letter I'd written explaining exactly what I knew and when I'd known it, were 2 things. One was a photograph of my wife on our wedding day. The other was a copy of the updated deed to my house, held in a trust that Dex's name would never appear on, now or in the future, under any circumstances. I included the photograph because I wanted him to see her. I wanted him to understand that this house, this life, these things he'd been quietly calculating, they weren't assets. They were a history. They were 31 years of a woman who hung a ceramic rooster in her kitchen and planted roses along the fence and taught our daughter to look people in the eye. They were not available for acquisition. The letter ended with a single sentence. "You can leave now, or Leonard can explain in detail why you should." Dex left. He didn't slam the door. He walked out the way he'd walked in, quietly, and I heard his car start and pull away, and then the house was very still. Renee sat at my kitchen table for a long time. I sat with her. I didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say that was more useful than just being there, and sometimes being there is the whole job. After a while, she said, "How long did you know?" "Suspicions for about a year. Certainty for about 6 weeks." "And you didn't tell me." "I told you as soon as I had something to tell." She thought about this. "He said you were getting confused. He talked about it at dinner one night, when you weren't there. He said he was worried about you. I know. He was building a case." "Yes." She looked at me. There was something in her expression I recognized from when she was a little girl. Not grief exactly, but the aftermath of it. The face that comes after the crying, when you're just trying to sort out what's real. "Why didn't you just confront him?" she asked. "Straight out? Because confronting him would have given him time to adjust, to lawyer up, to clean up, to tell a story. This way, he had no story. He was standing in my bedroom with his hand in a box that wasn't what he thought it was, and there were 3 people in the kitchen who knew exactly why." She nodded slowly. "Your grandfather," I said, "had a phrase he used. He said, 'Let the trap show them who they are.' He meant, don't tell someone they're a snake. Wait and see if they bite. You'll know the truth, and so will everyone else." Renee looked at the table. "I loved him," she said quietly. "I know. I really did. I know, sweetheart. That part wasn't wrong. That part was exactly right." She cried a little then. Not dramatically, just the kind of quiet crying that comes when you're exhausted and sad, and you've already made your peace with something even though it's still going to hurt for a long time. I got her a dish towel because I was out of tissues, which she laughed at a little through the tears, which felt like the right note. My nephew stayed until early afternoon. We had sandwiches. He told a few old stories about cases he'd worked, carefully edited to avoid the worst parts, because that's the kind of man he is. He hugged Renee before he left and said something quiet to her that I couldn't hear, and she nodded, and I didn't ask. The divorce took about 8 months. Dex, to his credit, or perhaps to the credit of whatever attorney he found, did not contest the property arrangements. There wasn't much to contest. Leonard had closed every door before Dex had even looked for them. Renee took her time. She moved back in for a few months, into her old room, which still has the shelf marks from the posters she hung in high school. We had dinner together most nights. She went back to work. She got a new coffee maker, a better one. She started sleeping through the night again, which I know because a mother always knows, and so, apparently, does a father. In the spring she planted something new in the yard. Not roses. She said roses were too much work, but a sage bush along the front walk that comes back every year on its own and doesn't need much tending. She put it in the ground herself on a Saturday morning while I watched from the porch with my coffee, and when she was done she stood up and brushed the dirt off her hands and said, "There, that stays." I thought about my wife and her roses. I thought about my grandfather and his phrase about traps. I thought about what it means to know yourself well enough, to know when someone's trying to rewrite the story of your life, and how the only answer to that is to hold the pen. "Yes," I said, "it does." She came and sat with me on the porch. We had our coffee. The yard was quiet. The cardinal came back to the birdbath, the old one, the one that's been there 20 years. Some things you hold on to, some things hold on all by themselves.